Okay, in this video, I'm going to use a 2005 to 2006 Suzuki GSX-R 1000 as an example. And this is why. On this picture, you can see typical horsepower and torque numbers these bikes produce. Peak horsepower is at 11,300 RPM. Peak torque is at 8,550 RPM. And rev limiter is set at 13,000 RPM. So when do you shift? At 13,000 RPM, at 11,000 RPM, where peak horsepower is at? Let's see if we can figure it out together. Let's concentrate on the torque curve and forget about the horsepower. Okay, first we need to figure out what the RPM drops when we shift. In this picture, we'll be able to see uh, what the RPM drop is. For example, in first gear at 13,000 RPM, you'll be doing 96.3 miles an hour. To figure out where it's going to be, we just have to match that number in second gear. And if you look in second gear at 10,500 RPM, you'll be doing 97.1 miles an hour. So if you were going to shift at 13,000 RPM, in first gear to second gear, the RPMs would drop to 10,500 RPM or pretty close to it. So that's pretty much a 2,500 RPM drop between first and second gear. Second, third gear, as you can see, the RPM drop is going to be around 2,000 RPM. Third and fourth, 1,500 RPM. Fourth and fifth, about 1,200 RPM. And final, fifth and sixth gear, it's about 900 RPM. Okay, in this picture, I put some numbers together. In red, you've got the RPMs, 7,000 to 13,000 RPM. Since the biggest drop is only 2,500 RPM, there's no point going any farther than 7,000 RPM. Should be plenty enough. In gray, I've got the final gear ratio. That's with the stock 1742 gear ratio. In yellow, I've got the engine torque, and in green, I've got the torque at the rear wheel. Basically, I took the numbers in the yellow and I multiplied it by numbers in the gray. So if you take, let's say 72 and multiply it by 9.8, you would come up with 707.976. Okay, in this picture I combined both tables. That way we can start to see if we can figure out when is the right time to shift. So let's start on a 1 to 2 shift. So let's start at 13,000 RPM. Let's see if we can shift at 13,000 RPM. Let's see what happens. So torque in first gear at 13,000 RPM is 557, and since we calculated before that the drop between first and second gear is 2,500 RPM, that's going to put us at 10,500 RPM. As we look on the table, we see that it's 586 torque in second gear at 10,500 RPM. It's higher than torque at in first gear at 13,000 RPM. That means that we're losing some power. We're losing acceleration. So we have to drop the RPM shift point. So at 12,500 RPM, we have 602 torque at the rear wheel. That's going to drop us to 10,000 RPM in second gear. And here we got 594 torque at the rear wheel at 10,000 RPM in second gear, and it's less than 602, which tells us that we should be shifting at around 12,600 RPM or so would be a perfect shift point. Okay, so next we're going to move to second gear to third gear shift point. Let's start at 13,000 RPM. In second gear we got 446 torque. If we shift to third gear, the RPM is going to drop by 2,000 RPM to 11,000 RPM, and the torque is 474, real close to 475. That number's higher, so we need to drop the RPMs. Let's try 12,500 RPM and see what happens. At 12,500 RPM in second gear, torque is 482. At the rear wheel, we drop by 2,000 RPM in third gear. That number comes up as a 490. It's still higher than the one in first gear, so we're gonna have to drop to 12,000 RPM. That number is 516 torque. It's gonna drop us to 10,000 RPM, and that number is 496, which is less than 516. That means that the perfect shift point should be somewhere between 12,000, 1200, should be between 12,000 and 12,500 RPM from second to third gear. Seem to be, it'll probably be close to 12,400 RPM. Okay, next we're going to move to shift point from third to fourth gear. Let's start at 12,500 RPM, since we already found out that 13,000 RPM was too high from second to third gear, and the RPM drop is going to be less. It's going to be 1,500 RPM drop going from third to fourth gear. So at 12,500 RPM, we have 403 torque at the rear wheel. If we drop by 1,500 RPM in fourth gear, we have 415 torque at the rear wheel, which is higher than 403. That means we need to lower the RPM, shifting RPM. So at 12,000 RPM, we have 431 torque at the rear wheel in third gear. If we drop it by 1,500 RPM, the torque's going to be 528, which is less. That tells us that perfect shift point would be around 12,100 RPM, just a little bit higher than 12,000 RPM. Okay, let's do the same thing from fourth to fifth gear. Let's start at fourth gear, 12,500 RPM. We got 352 torque. Since we already calculated that the RPM drop from fourth to fifth gear would be around 1,200 RPM, let's just round the number off to 1,000 RPM and see what we got. Looks like we got 360 torque at the rear wheel in fifth gear at 11,500 RPM, which is higher than 352. That means we gotta drop the RPMs to 12,000 RPM. So let's compare the numbers again. At 12,000 RPM in fourth gear, we got 377 torque. And if we check for torque in fifth gear at 11,000 RPM, that's 376, which sounds right about it sounds pretty damn close to being right on the money. So fourth to fifth gear, 12,000 RPM would be a perfect shift point. Okay, last but not least, shift point going from fifth gear to final sixth gear. Let's start at 12,000 RPM. In fifth gear, the torque is 342 at the rear wheel. Since we already calculated, the RPM drop is going to be around 900 RPM between the two gears. Let's make it 1,000. That way it's easy to see on this table. So at 11,000 RPM in sixth gear, the torque is 352, which is higher than 342 torque in fifth gear. That means we gotta drop the shift point some more. So torque at 11,500 RPM in fifth gear is 360. By dropping 1,000 RPM in sixth gear, it comes out to 363, which is still just a tiny bit higher, but not by much. Which tells me that a perfect shift point from fifth to sixth gear would probably be around 11,400 RPM or so.